Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on how to manage trustee disputes. I'm Josie. I'm Practical Support Lead here at NCVO, and I'm really delighted to be joined today by Sally Stevens, our Lead Governance Consultant at NCVO, Alison Smith, CEO of Roots HR CIC, and Jan Golding, founder and former CEO of Roots HR CIC. So in this webinar, in case you didn't realise this, we will be exploring everything to do with managing trustee disputes, from being clear about your duty as a trustee, to the steps you can take to de-escalate conflict, to what you can do if you can't resolve a dispute. On to the next slide, please. So just before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping points to note. So first up, closed captions or subtitles have been enabled. You can turn these on and off by clicking on the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. And in just a minute, we will be sharing the slide deck for today in the chat as a PDF. So if it does help with accessibility, you can download the slide deck to your computer and zoom in and out of the slides as we go along. So today's webinar is 1 hour and we're going to be running straight through without a break. So hopefully you've got a refreshment with you. We will have time to take questions at the end, probably about 10 to 15 minutes. So please do submit any questions that you have via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please don't, if possible, add questions to the chat as they are likely to get lost. So please do just use the Q&A function. For some people, there might be a lot going on in the chat and it can be quite distracting. So just to let you know, you can click on the chat at the bottom of the screen, which will close the chat box. You may have noticed that the webinar today is being recorded, and by being here, you acknowledge this. The recording, as is fairly normal for us, will be put on our YouTube channel. Everyone has joined on view-only mode, which means that you're only going to be able to see the people speaking. So you're only going to be able to view our speakers rather than everyone that's on the webinar today. And finally, a copy of the slides are going to be sent to everyone via email with all the links to kind of recommended areas of support that we talk about. So moving on to the next slide. So just a quick overview of what we hope you'll get from today. So by the end of the webinar, you should understand why serious disagreement or conflict involving trustees happens. You'll learn steps you can take to prevent a disagreement from escalating. You'll know what to do if a conflict arises, and we'll be absolutely sure that you know where to go for further support should you need it. Moving on to the next slide. So I'm just doing a quick introduction. I'm then going to hand over to Sally, who's going to talk a little bit about the duties of a trustee in the context of managing a dispute. And later on, she's going to give us some tools that hopefully will help you to navigate a dispute if and when it arises. Then she's going to hand over to Jan, who's going to talk about the causes of disputes and conflict, the conflict escalator, practical steps you can take to de-escalate conflict. And later on, she's going to share some lessons that she's learned from her own experience as a mediator. And then finally, at the end, I will facilitate a short Q&A session. Next slide, please. So we're just going to do a quick poll to get us started, which is really very simple, which is, what is the main reason for you joining us today? Just to give us an understanding of why you're here. So are you currently involved in a trustee dispute? You're just interested in the topic? You think it's an important topic for maybe future work that you're going to be involved in? Or you can put something else in the chat. So I'll just give that a minute for people to submit their answers. I'm not sure. Has that been launched, Holly? Sorry.
Yes, it's launched. Do you want me to, can you, if you
share
I can read out
the results come through?
Would you like me to read them out?
Yeah, please. Sorry, I
That's
can't see
okay,
them.
don't worry. So 10%, 4 people said they're currently involved in a trustee dispute. 37%, so 15 people said they're interested in the topic. 49%, so nearly half, said they think this is an important topic for their work in the future. And 5%, so 2 people said something else, and looks like they've put it in the chat.
Cool. Great stuff. So most people here because they think it's an important topic, which I would heartily agree with. And luckily, only a minority of you are actually going through a trustee dispute, which we know can be really stressful and quite emotionally draining at this moment in time. So that's nice to know. So good. I think, therefore, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sally.
Thanks, Josie, and thank you everyone for being here. It's nice to see you, to meet you. As Josie said at the start, my name's Sally. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the lead governance consultant at NCVO. So I work with a team of other governance consultants, and we really specialise in this question of good decision making, practice in terms of what your structures look like to move your organisation forward at that really strategic level. And I'm really interested in talking about this topic to you today because one of the things that I think we find really commonly when we speak to trustee boards as part of our work, either in training or as consultants, is that the question of how to manage disputes comes up often because governance, while it sometimes feels like it's a little bit administrative, like it can be a little bit bureaucratic, actually is really a practical exercise. And we want our trustees to feel that they are really delivering good governance, and it's very human, very personal, very people-centered. But what that also means is that, of course, there is the potential for differences of opinion to arise. And this is a particularly important thing to recognise as trustees, because as trustees, those decision makers hold some key legal and statutory duties that they are required to embody. And I've got those on my screen now. So your 6 statutory duties as a trustee are to comply with your charity's governing document and the law, to ensure your charity is accountable, to act with reasonable care and skill, to ensure the charity is carrying out its purposes for the public benefit, act in your charity's best interest, to manage your charity's resources responsibly. And we expect trustees to always be making use of these duties to anchor all of their decision making for the organisation, while at the same time bringing forward their own perspective, opinions, experience, knowledge, which is, you know, such a fundamental part of how we move our organisations forward. And I'd like to zoom in for a moment on one of our 4 duties, which is, as a collective group of decision makers in the organisation, trustees are required to act in the best interests of the charity. And this is often the area where we find disputes starting to emerge between trustees, because the reality is, even if you have a very clearly set out set of charitable objects, even if you have a defined strategic plan, there may be multiple options which would be in the best interests of the charity. There would be multiple things that you might be able to do, or ways that you might be able to move the organisation forward, decisions you might be able to take, which would be in the best interests of the organisation. And if we find that trustees are holding these views which are counter to one another but would both progress the organisation, it's very easy for a dispute to emerge. However, part of acting in your charity's best interests is having the ability to act collectively. And once the board comes together around a decision, it is important that all trustees, whether they were part of the discussion or not, are able to stand behind that decision. And so managing trustee disputes goes beyond just being able to work together and have kind of a compatibility working as colleagues. It actually is an alignment to these statutory duties that you have. So there is a requirement that you manage conflict really well on your board. So when we're thinking about how do we act in our organisation's best interest, things that trustees need to be bearing in mind are actually acknowledging and managing where there might be conflicted interests. Yes, there might be multiple different routes that we can take. Are we being led slightly by our own perspective? Are we being biased by something which is actually an individual interest and that we probably need to declare and manage? For example, are we individually or is someone related to us going to benefit from taking a particular route? That is a conflict of interest. And as a board, we need to be able to collectively manage that. Are we making these decisions collaboratively and are we reaching consensus? Sometimes when we come to a decision, it may not be a final decision that anyone first proposed, but it might be a middle ground between multiple different options. But as long as we're all able to stand behind that decision, that should hopefully really reduce disputes and increase the likelihood that we can all stick behind that decision and not get into conflict. So are we, really actively trying to make those decisions collaboratively? Do we recognise when we've got our personal opinions and views which might create bias? And I think bias stands aside from conflict of interest, because even if we don't really have kind of any stake in the decision, we may still have underlying biases, experiences, institutional structures that we're used to, which guide us down a particular path over another option. So being really mindful of that, trying to make sure that any bias is really conscious rather than unconscious, can really help in achieving this duty of acting in your organisation's best interest. And then having the ability ultimately to draw the line between feelings and facts. We want trustees to be emotionally and individually invested as people. That's a huge part of how we benefit from decision making, is because we have invested and passionate individuals at that level. But ultimately, if we're meeting this duty to act in your organisation's best interest, we need to be taking those decisions and creating action that is anchored in the facts of the case and that is objective, rather than being too coloured by those subjective elements that might come into play. And it's when those subjective elements start to come into play that we really start to more keenly see those gaps emerging, those ruptures, the start of conflict and dispute. And on that note, I will hand over to Jan to talk a little bit more about actually why that occurs.
Thank you, Sally. Hello, everybody. So I'm Jan Golding. I am an associate HR consultant for Roots HR, and in that capacity, I'm also a trained and qualified mediator. I've become a specialist over the years, really, in dispute resolution and complex and senior casework. Roots HR is a trusted supplier to the NCVO, and we help small to medium-sized not-for-profit organisations to elevate their people management. We provide high-quality HR consultancy services, and we use our trading surpluses to deliver free training toolkits, fact sheets and webinars to improve leadership and management in our sector. So in terms of conflict and why it occurs at board level, well, all disagreements are caused by actual or perceived differences or misunderstandings, and at board level in a charity, different perspectives can occur between two or more trustees, or may develop between trustees and one or more employees or workers or volunteers. It can be a matter of one trustee with a different viewpoint to another, or it can be a case of a split board with trustees polarising into two or more factions or camps, sometimes with board members standing back and refusing to take a side or trying to remain neutral. It can often be a matter of different perspectives on one or more aspects of work or performance between a board member and the chief exec, or your most senior employee, whatever you know them as. For example, where the chair takes the role of that employee's line manager, that's often a cause for disputes arising. So charity boards are fertile ground for people coming together with very different expectations and viewpoints. Just a few examples might be the longer term direction of the organisation, the use of funds or resources, income generation methods, ethics, conduct, performance standards, or preferences in how you might go about delivering a project. Now, it's important that I make it clear from the outset that different viewpoints and organisations should be welcome and will, in most cases, be healthy. As Sally was saying just now, different viewpoints, when presented and handled with respect and dignity, will usually lead to the best possible decision being taken in a situation, with everybody remaining warm and cordial towards one another, even if the final route determined is not the option they themselves put forward or preferred. So this webinar is not about those differing viewpoints in themselves. And disagreements may not be angry or emotional in the first instance. Escalation occurs when one person responds to another in a manner which, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, threatens or angers another person. So examples include being disrespectful or being dismissive or rude, making something personal, causing embarrassment, being threatening, or being aggressive or confrontational. And this can happen for a variety of reasons, often stemming from differences in values or beliefs or needs or goals or expectations. So some of the common causes of board level escalation are going to be poor communication or misunderstandings, conflicting values, for example, cultural or religious or personal beliefs can create misunderstandings, change and uncertainty, change in circumstances or environments can create anxiety or lead to resistance. There can be emotional triggers, so people can feel personally triggered, and that can amplify a disagreement and lead to conflict. There can be unmet needs, people feeling their basic needs, such as safety or recognition, are not being met. Sometimes they don't realise that's what's happening. There can be power dynamics, so a struggle for power or control within relationships or within the organisation. And there can be a competition for limited resources like money or land or time. Those things can lead to conflicts as well. Can you move me on, please, Sally? Thank you. So I'm going to use the words dispute and conflict interchangeably in this webinar. Let's have a look at the possible solutions for resolving conflict when it arises. We're going to be focusing in this webinar on interpersonal disputes between individuals or groups of individuals. Possible solutions for sorting out that kind of a dispute include, and this is what I'd always promote, informal conversation between the parties to start with, or informal conversation between the parties facilitated by a third party, somebody else being present. Mediation is always a popular option. The difference between this and a facilitated conversation is that mediation recognises that the parties definitely need active help to reach a resolution. They're not going to sort it out by themselves. With a facilitated conversation, the involvement of the third party is light touch, and in its most basic form, it's simply to enable the parties to feel safe in meeting to talk. With mediation, the mediator guides and leads the process with the aim, brings the skill set, with the aim of supporting the parties to reach a resolution. In some cases, your dispute will be settled by internal processes, particularly where employees are involved. For example, where there's a grievance process which involves an employee, there'd be an investigation and a formal hearing which will give a determination on a dispute. Sometimes one or both parties leaves the organisation, and sometimes one or both parties is removed from the organisation. So, for example, dismissal if an employee is involved, or steps within the constitutional document if trustees are involved. You can even get to a place where a charity trustee is struck off from acting. Sally will talk more about that later on in the webinar. I'm not advocating for people leaving as a way to settle disputes. I'm just being factual about the options. Sometimes it's the only viable option. On the right on this slide, where matters are at an organisational level, i.e. your organisation is in dispute with another, there are some other options open. We're not going to talk about those today, but I just want to make you aware of things like adjudication, where disputes require a binding written decision from a qualified neutral, often mandated as part of a statutory process. There's arbitration, where an independent third party is appointed to actually decide the outcome of a dispute. So the parties choose to resolve their dispute that way, and they sign up to accept the outcome, whatever that might be. You can have an early neutral evaluation where a preliminary assessment is made of a matter that can help parties avoid litigation, and there can be expert determination, where an independent expert makes a binding decision on technical issues within a dispute. But we're not going to talk about those in detail today, because the situations where they would be applicable are comparatively rare. But I wanted you to know there are options available in certain specific circumstances. And we've got a poll. Holly, would you like to take us through this poll? So we'd like to know whether or not you've ever taken part in a mediation or a process intended to resolve a dispute. So have you personally been involved before in a mediation or dispute resolution? Yes, you have, or no, you've never been involved personally. Doesn't mean that you've been the subject of it. You might have been somebody who was helping to put it right and to resolve it. Holly, how's that looking in terms of people voting and results?
Yeah, nearly there. I think most people have voted. Just give it a sec. Okay. Share the results. Jan, can you see that, or do you need me to read them?
No, that's good, thank you. So
Great.
29% of you are saying that you have personally taken part in a mediation or dispute previously, and the other 71% are saying no, you haven't. So thank you. That's interesting to know that the strong majority of you haven't, thankfully, been involved to date in a mediation or a dispute. Moving on to the next slide then. I'm going to talk about a very, very handy tool here called the conflict escalator. And when a dispute begins and escalates, assessing the level at which the conflict is operating will be fundamental in deciding what strategies or interventions will be possible and more likely to be successful, and whether the situation needs more than a conflict mediator or facilitator can offer. So this slide is a gauge to help identify when conflict is beyond the point of self-help and requires outside help. The downward steps indicate a conflict deepening. We're going to share this with you as part of a fact sheet for reference after the webinar, and there'll be a bit more detail on it then as well. But at level 1, which is the first one, number 1's missing, but the top step, at this point, you know you've got a problem starting to happen, because you've got points of view beginning to harden and differences and tensions become obvious. There can be a sense of caution and carefulness. There might be awareness of potential conflict building and of wanting to avoid it. And at this level, those people involved in it still very much want to find a way to cooperate and restore the relationship. But there may already be a lack of spontaneity, resulting in internal restrictions about what to say to the other person, which can be healthy sometimes, but also it can dampen creativity. At level 2, by now, the parties might have stopped listening to one another to some degree, and there can be the beginnings of individual points of view strengthening. You might get more polarity in views appearing, and then an individual becomes more sure, more right about their opinions, and they begin attempts perhaps at diminishing someone else's perspective and finding the weaknesses in their argument. They might be looking for other people to join them and back them up. And at this point, people stop listening to the other party and start an internal conversation, because they're focusing on what they want to say. Healthy debate is when people are still listening to one another. Unhealthy debate is when they become polarised with fixed views, and it starts to become more important at that stage that somebody proves they're right. By the time we get to level 3, there's becoming less reason to continue with the debate, as the individuals are no longer reaching one another. They really look like they might have made up their respective minds and perhaps start taking actions without involving or consulting the other person. They are becoming more suspicious and watchful of what the other person says rather than what they say. Sorry, what they do rather than what they say. There's an increased lack of trust and there's less empathy. They might start to remove themselves from communicating with one another, or revert to email rather than face-to-face or telephone. They might start to involve other people more with the intent of building support for themselves and getting other people on their side. They stop talking at this stage, as they think the other person isn't going to see that they're right anyway, and this leads them to push each other further and further away. They start looking for behaviour to confirm their view, of how the other party is, and they use that as an opportunity to build their case against them. A couple of points to note here. At this level 3, if there's enough self-awareness and respect, it is possible for individuals to move back up the escalator and out of conflict. Once a conflict is beyond level 3, the parties are going to need internal or external help to do that. The weaker the relationship was before this started, the more difficult that's going to be, and the more important it's going to be aware of the potential to descend from this point into more conflict. The fact sheet we're going to send out goes into more detail on this, but at levels 4 to 6, the parties' view of each other becomes more fixed and polarised, and they become more and more convinced they're in the right. As they start to take moral stances, and their perception of each other has been decided upon, and any evidence that might suggest otherwise is being ignored. They become more judgmental in their opinions, have increasing views on what they should or ought to be doing, and they stop seeing the humanity in each other. They actively seek out other people who will be on their side and expect them to take up the cause. And even if one party starts to behave differently or adapt their views, it won't be picked up or noticed or appreciated by the other. It starts to become Cold War. And as matters progress now, one or both now might start to become threatening with ultimatums or sanctions or consequences. In the workplace, this might look like the threat of involving unions, or bringing in health and safety, or the media, going to the media, or reporting to external bodies such as the Charity Commission. So threats start to be made, and overall the stress of the situation becomes much higher for everyone involved. This is, by this stage, if it's an employee, there's usually a grievance or a disciplinary around, and this will take the conflict to a new level, because the individuals become ingrained in the belief as to who's right and who's wrong. If you're at level 6, the parties are going to need some form of conflict resolution, and it's going to take a person acting independently in that capacity to help either prevent the conflict getting worse or to de-escalate it when it's already become destructive or confrontational or even aggressive. So by the time you get to level 7 to 9, it's no longer about winning, it's about destroying the other party. And the other parties become the enemy, and they're seen as more of an object than a person. The situations become quite cold and clinical, and the parties can even take pleasure in the pain or the suffering of one another. This phase can be quite selective and tactical, as they're quite intent on harming one another or taking each other out. And the original issue probably isn't the problem anymore. It's probably not even important now. It becomes about reputation and the need to be vindicated. And sometimes in the worst situation at level 9, an individual will risk destroying themselves, their reputation, their job, everything, as long as they take the other party with them. And the conflict's now in control of them rather than them being in control of the conflict. The further down the escalator, of course, that the parties have travelled, the longer it takes for a relationship to heal. And that's only ever going to be possible if both parties or all people involved in the dispute are fully committed to the resolution. Could you move me on, please, Sally? Lovely, thank you. Assuming that in terms of actually preventing this from happening, preventing a situation from getting worse, assuming there's no written grievance or complaint submitted by an employee, someone needs to encourage the parties to meet informally when the diagnosis is level 1 or 2 at the worst, really, to discuss their differences. Ideally, this conversation with each individual would come from somebody on your board who's got more seniority than those involved in the dispute. That might be a chair or a vice chair or a treasurer, but all boards are different, and some may not have those offices, and in some of the cases the dispute might involve people that are in those offices. But if you're concerned that a dispute is arising or a relationship breaking down because between board members or board members and employees, please do take action at the earliest possible opportunity. That might simply be discussing the matter with another trustee who agrees to take action if they're in a better position to do it than you. try and get the individuals to meet individually, informally, to discuss their differences. It's always on a voluntary basis, and any agreements made as a result of that are binding only in spirit. Things can break down again, of course, but in my experience, early informal resolution is always worth a try. It's always helpful to suggest some basic ground rules for the parties, such as a time length for the meeting, no raised voices, confidentiality, how that's going to apply. They may or may not want a third party there as an observer or a facilitator. It's important they both feel safe and comfortable going to the meeting. I'd suggest the further down the escalator they are, the more advisable it is for someone else to be present. And the further down the escalator they are, the more skilled and experienced in dispute resolution that person needs to be. And even if there has been a formal written grievance coming in from an employee, for example, the chief exec against the chair or something like that, it is always worth attempting this informal step of the parties meeting informally. If the grievance has come in, but they manage to resolve it informally, thank goodness, and the party who submitted the grievance can simply write to retract it. That doesn't stop them from resubmitting it in the future in the event that things break down then. So, reading back to you, Sally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jan. Ultimately, there may be times where you do need those additional tools to help supporting a dispute position. And Jan started talking there about some of the approaches you might take. There are also mechanisms in your governance that can help when you're looking at managing or addressing a conflict or a dispute as well. So when we're thinking about those kind of trustee level experiences, remember you can always go back to your governing document. That is your rulebook as a charity. It will set out clearly who can make decisions, which may include, for example, members making decisions about appointment or removal of trustees, how many of those people are needed to make a decision, so the terms of decision making, so whether decisions have to be in person, whether they can be in writing, whether they can be made over a video call, the quorum, which is the number of people who need to be involved. And also your governing document will define some of the scope of those decisions, the powers of decision making. So that's always a really good first tool to remember that you have as a mechanism when you need to progress decision in any of these areas. And then it's really good practice as an organisation to think about what secondary instruments you might like to create that will support any kind of decision making. And I kind of take note of the fact that in our first poll, the majority of people said that they understood how important a topic this is, or that it's really relevant to their role, rather than being actively involved in a dispute. And I think it's worth saying when you're thinking about some of these secondary instruments, putting them in place before a dispute starts is going to be the most useful for you. It's about being prepared that if something did go wrong, you would have useful mechanisms to point out within your governance. And those things might include detailed bylaws for the way you might run an AGM, an annual general meeting, or any members' meetings. And having that clearly defined is useful if your members are the people who have powers in your governing document to make decisions. You need to be able to help those members to understand the bounds of their own decision-making in that space. You might want to put together a code of practice for how you operate within meetings, particularly in those board spaces and board and senior team spaces. So setting out how you engage with each other, when issues might be raised and in what way, whether you communicate via the chair or vice chair if you're adding something to the agenda, for example. That really helps manage expectations and reduces the likelihood that where a difference of opinion occurs, that it's going to escalate into that space of conflict and dispute, because everyone understands what the situation is that they're walking into. There's no surprises. And the same is true of having a code of conduct, something that clearly sets out the expected approach and behaviours, what those look like for you in practice, because that also gives you something to point at, to say, you're not meeting our expectations and here's why. And it's much easier, I think, to start having those conversations, even at an informal level, when you have some of these mechanisms that you can point at and show the agreed practice that is expected in the organisation. So, Alison, I think it's over to you.
No, it's me.
Oh, I apologise. Jan, go for it.
That's okay. So I thought it might be useful to share a couple of case studies as we go through this webinar with you. And the first one is about it's about an anonymised case that I resolved informally. So I worked quite recently with a London-based organisation where where there was a female chief exec and a younger male trustee was taking the role of their CEO, and the trustee viewed them as having problems in their working relationship for a few reasons. And one particular thing brought matters to a head. The chief exec was overdue to deliver a long-term piece of important but not urgent project work, which was when she'd missed the deadline and failed to acknowledge it. Basically, there was a low-level dispute here developing between the chief exec and the trustee as the line manager. But when the chief exec wouldn't acknowledge the problem in the first instance, and when the trustee went back to it with them, the chief exec dug in and wouldn't acknowledge it as being a problem, and the dispute therefore clearly was becoming entrenched rather than actually moving forward. The trustee felt the matter needed addressing, both in terms of discussing a project that was overdue and the chief exec's reaction when he tried to broach it with her. And he felt that he wanted a conversation with her in a situation where she might feel safe, perhaps with a third party present. And the trustee spoke to the chair about his concerns, and the chair asked both parties if they were willing to have such a conversation. Chief exec agreed. The chair came and took advice from us as professional mediators. And I was able to use the conflict escalator to find that this was a dispute that was at level 1 to 2. It therefore had a very good prospect of being resolved through the meeting to talk. The charity asked if I could facilitate the conversation, and I simply did that through a Teams call. There were no specific organisational policies relating to a conflict between a trustee and a chief exec, but the policies that could become relevant in the future for the chief exec were potentially disciplinary, presumably, and capability, and even the grievance policy if they weren't happy about the way they were treated. So I spoke to them both individually and in confidence to help them prepare to meet together by teams. And the meeting went ahead. I agreed some my role with them, confidentiality and the ground rules. The meeting went ahead, and we had a 2-hour meeting, and they used it to resolve their situation. I asked them to prepare 5 minutes of protected time at the beginning of the meeting when they would each explain their position and the other would listen without interrupting. And that went very smoothly. That protected time technique worked very well for them both, and the chief exec relaxed, and they got the situation sorted out between them. Could you move my slide on, please, Sally? Thank you. There are several reasons why a conflict might progress beyond level 3, and if you can't resolve something informally, or you pick up a dispute when it's already past that level 3 on the conflict escalator, if there is a conflict arising, this slide would suggest that if that's between 2 board members, have a look for whether you've got any organisational policies or documents that would guide the situation. We so rarely see these. Sally was talking earlier on about codes of conduct and things for boards. We so rarely see them in practice, but they are very, very helpful if you've got them. Real good fallback in this situation. But if you are the person that's picking up helping the parties to move forward, speak to them to understand their preferred way forward in reaching a resolution. Check and see if you've got any resources available. For example, could the organisation afford mediation? You possibly may not have anybody internally that would be suitable to deliver that. There can be whistleblowers in these circumstances. Sometimes the reason the dispute has arisen is because of a disclosure about something or a matter that would be protected if it was brought into the public domain. And a board member can be a whistleblower. That's a recent piece of case law. So make sure that whistleblowers suffer no detriment, and consider whether any aspect of what's going on triggers the duty to report report the matter as a serious incident to the Charities Commission. There's some guidance on that on a link that we're providing at the end of the webinar as well. If this dispute is between a board member or board members and employees, do all of those things, but you've got to realise that in this situation, any action that's taken needs to be in line with the organisation's grievance policy, probably even if what's happened hasn't been presented to you as a grievance in writing. It probably triggers your grievance policy through what's actually happened. So you'd need to make sure that anything you're doing there would satisfy the grievance policy. Could you move me on, please, Sally? Thank you. A short case study on when a dispute has gone a bit further, and a mediation was actually used. I mediated recently in an active and escalating dispute between a CEO and a chair, and other parties had become involved because they'd already deepened the dispute. They were looking for other people on the board to take their sides. Basically, the chair didn't want the organisation to go for a big piece of funding, and the chief exec had already gone for it and was already putting the tender in. And there were business level issues to be resolved as to whether or not the organisation should be going for that tender. It wasn't for the chief exec to decide, and it wasn't for the chair to decide. And my first involvement was to get them to recognise that. And they did. And actually, they then dealt with that appropriately and had a board level decision that they were going to go for the funding. But that didn't satisfy either the chair or the chief exec. The relationship was left damaged. And there was mediation then done, which also involved the vice chair, because the chair themselves was about to go off and be away for a little while. So I held preparation meetings to get the individuals ready, in particular to help the chief exec to say a number of things that she wanted to say to the chair about her view on the chair's fitness to lead the board and the organisation. And I helped her to frame those things, as in using mediation skills, helped her to frame those things in a way that was kind and easier for the chair to hear, and therefore had a better chance of landing and forming part of the of a healthy resolution to the dispute. They went ahead on that basis. There was some ground rules in place. We had an agenda agreed. That was very important, getting an agenda agreed in advance, what they were going to talk about, what the dispute was really about. It went ahead on that basis, and a written agreement was made, and all parties signed up to it. So it was successful, and that relationship remains in place even today, with all the parties still working together on the board. When you get the slides, I think because we're going to be a little bit short on time, if you could move me on, please, Sally. Thank you. There is a slide that explains the actual mediation process to you, but we've already talked about that and demonstrated it through this case study, so I'm not going to go into it now. Could you move me on again, please? Thank you. Hang on, where are we? Ah, I think we're with you now, Sally, aren't we? Oh, no, no, it's key learning points.
Yeah.
And then it's with you. Okay, so the key learning points, your takeaways from this are to act promptly. It's so much easier to achieve a full and lasting resolution if relationships haven't really become fully damaged yet. Use a third party to broker the situation and to help diffuse the inevitable emotions that arise in the situation. Make sure you are compliant with the organisation's policies. Check what you've got in place and use them. You may have to renegotiate them with the parties if they're a bit out of date, but don't do something that doesn't meet with your organisational policies. Clarify in advance with the parties. If there's going to be a meeting, make sure there's some pre-work done so that the agenda points for discussion are known in advance. You'll just end up in conflict in the meeting if they haven't agreed the agenda in advance, believe you me, and agree with them in advance the ground rules for conduct in meetings. Those are my key learning points, your takeaways. if you're going to be involved in actively helping someone parties resolve a dispute. And now it really is over to you, Sally. Sorry.
Thank you. So, you know, ultimately, I think we have to recognise that there are worst case scenarios that occur where a dispute can't be resolved easily. And quite a few of you have put questions in the Q&A already asking, so what's the escalation? And I did want to make sure that we touch on this. Sometimes those divisions and classes are too complex to resolve without support. Supportive mechanisms that you can have and develop in your organisation have disciplinary and complaints processes which are in place for trustees. These aren't going to be the same as your employment processes, and it's not appropriate often to try and rely on a process that's designed for staff with your trustees because they do hold different status, they're volunteers. So having a specific disciplinary and complaints process that is centred on trustees is really worth having. That process should set out what the routes are to complain. It should detail what possible areas of complaint you might engage with and uphold. So, for example, will you receive complaints about behaviour, but you won't receive complaints about decision making, for example, because it is the duty of trustees to make decisions. And if someone has an issue with a decision, it might not be appropriate to complain about an individual trustee in that instance. So be clear about what areas of complaint you would engage with through that process, and then set out the process. How will you respond to a complaint? Who will be involved in managing that complaint? You know, as Jan's described, there are various mechanisms you might use. Set that out in writing. Those processes ideally should have appeals baked into them because we want to make sure that we are being fair and appropriate to all parties involved. And it is possible that you receive vexatious complaints as well, complaints which actually are not fair reflection of the reality between trustees and staff or others. Where you do uphold a complaint through these processes, the disciplinary process that is related to that should set out clear outcomes. And again, I've popped into the Q&A a couple of the potential outcomes that you might see. It might be that you ask a trustee to engage in some informal coaching on their behaviours. It might be that you have a more regular process of performance review for that given trustee. It might be that they step down from a certain group. There are all kinds of things which you might have as clear outcomes, including removing that trustee from your board, but you want to make sure that that is clearly detailed as part of the process. And then whatever outcomes you define, you also want to make sure that those are supported by your governing document. And that might mean making changes there as well. We see a lot of charities which don't have mechanisms in their governing document to remove trustees. And it is worth having a clearly defined clause in your governing document that says the board has the ability to remove a trustee if they are found to be in breach of internal disciplinary and complaints policies, for example. So something that gives you that mechanism and provision to actually remove a trustee, but only following an appropriate and comprehensive process. Josie.
Thank you, Sally, and thanks, Jan, as well. I think those have both been excellent presentations and really a kind of deep dive into this area, which is actually hugely complicated and yeah, can be very stressful, as I've said already. So thank you both. A couple of the questions have already been answered. So we have got, though, a few more which we can dig into. So the first one, I thought maybe, Sally, you might have a view on this, on what is your view on the Constitution giving the chair a deciding vote?
I definitely do have some thoughts on this. I think it's useful. I think it can be a really helpful mechanism. And a thing to remember when we're thinking about the composition of our board is that the chair is one among equals. Legally speaking, the chair is just a trustee and they have the same trustee duties under law as every other trustee in the space. When we create our trustee role and our trustee role description, what we're actually doing is delegating. That is a type of delegation from the board to that individual on the board. And we might do the same thing with other honorary roles as well. So you might have a treasurer, you might have a secretary, and all of those are delegations. So those people remain one among equals, but we are asking them to take on an additional role on our behalf, and actually asking the chair to have that final casting vote is giving them a little bit of extra kind of power, yes, but it's ultimately helping us as a board to make good decisions and to not get caught in a deadlock. So I think having that power in your constitution is useful if it's going to avoid that deadlock situation. But I also think it's really useful to have clearly defined in some of those secondary instruments, like your complaints procedure, like your disciplinary procedure, what you do in the case that, for example, the chair is conflicted or the chair is implicated as part of the dispute, so that you're not tied into a situation where the chair having the casting vote actually creates a situation of unfairness, and that you've always got somewhere to step back to where perhaps the vice chair steps in or another trustee steps in, recognising that actually giving the chair that second vote is just, it's facilitating the work of the board, and they are still one among equals. The policies and procedures just still absolutely apply to them.
Great, thank you, Sally. Another question that's come in. So what happens if a dispute has escalated in response to an initial complaint not being addressed by the chairperson? Sally, do you want to go again on this one? Yeah.
Yeah, I can. So I'd say in this situation, what you're actually looking at is two complaints. So you have your initial complaint, and the fact that that's not been addressed is an issue, and we still need to return and we need to approach that initial complaint appropriately. But what I would read here is that now a secondary complaint has emerged, which is about the chairperson and the way that they're engaging and the way that they're undertaking their role. And I think when looking at how you would manage that dispute and how it's escalated, pulling those two things apart, being really clear, is going to be a really useful way of them progressing that conversation, because actually the dispute around the skill and quality of the chairperson in delivering their job shouldn't influence the initial complaint and the way that that's handled. So I'd be seeing those as two separate situations, and unfortunately that may mean two separate processes and two separate positions on that conflict escalator, but I think it's worth putting those apart and separating them.
Great, thank you, that's really helpful. I'm conscious that we have two questions in here which are about signposting to relevant policies. So one around an example of a trustee disciplinary policy, and one around sort of templates, a code of conduct template. Both of these we can absolutely signpost to in a follow-up email. We do have some template policies outlined in our help and guide, NCVO's help and guidance. Some of them are member only, have member only access, but others are sort of freely available. So yeah, we can do some signposting for those, no problem, in a follow-up email. The final question that we have I'm going to get us to probably respond to that individually, I think, rather than read it out. It's a very specific problem for an organisation that I think probably would be best dealt with outside of this webinar. So we'll follow up with that separately. I think that is it. Oh no, there is one more. Sorry. How do you deal with hearsay complaints if it is about a new chairperson raised by old chairperson? Ooh. Jan, do you want to say anything on this? Have you had any experience of this kind of thing?
No, not that specific scenario, but there are so many ways that people can find to fall out with one another, Josie. Everyone that we get is a new one, really. Sally, I can comment on it, but I don't know whether Sally's had any first-hand experience of it to share. No. So, and we're a bit short on time. I'm not the biggest fan of hearsay, generally. I think it can be dangerous, but it would depend on what I'm hearing in the hearsay and how serious it is and how fundamental it is to the reputation of the organisation and so on. And I think you'd probably, as the new chair, want to it depends if the old chair is still present. If the old chair is hearsay complaints about a new chairperson raised by the old chairperson. So I would ask for the evidence basis for them. That's the starting point. That's the starting point, is what's the evidence basis. If there's no evidence basis, then I wouldn't take it forward. But I might keep an eye on the situation to see if I thought I could see the same sort of thing evidencing itself to me firsthand, in which case I'd be then in a position to deal with it with confidence and without causing upset to people. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you. I'm going to move on. Yeah, the person that asked the question, thanked you for your response. So yeah, that does answer the question. I'm going to move on because we've only got a few minutes left, and I am very conscious that we've got just one or two more things to add before we go. If we could go on, Sally, to the kind of further support and guidance, as people asked about this. So yeah, just to highlight a few bits of guidance. So we do have some guidance within our NCVO help and guidance content on dealing with problems and disputes between trustees. So please do feel free to take a look at that. I'd also urge you, I know we haven't mentioned it today, but to have a look at the Charity Commission guidance on disagreements and disputes. And yeah, take a look at that, and they do outline where they will and where they will not intervene. And then finally, just a reminder that if you do sort of have further kind of quick fire questions, particularly in the governance space that you feel that we haven't answered today, we do have a small charity help desk which you can contact. You can scan our QR code there, and that will take you straight to our contact details. And we do also have, if you've enjoyed our governance chat today, we do also have some governance training available, and there's a link to that there. I'm going to hand over to Alison quickly just to run through a little bit more about how Roots can help you out, and then we'll be finishing off.
Thanks, Josie. So yeah, so in addition to obviously the help that the NCVO that Josie's just pointed out, we know that obviously disputes and conflicts can be very stressful, upsetting, and can often devastating for those people. So at Roots, we want to genuinely help as much as we can. So we offer a wide range of free resources. There's a link on the next slide, and you'll get a copy of the slides, which takes you to all the free resources on our website. Feel free to order as many as you can use and signpost other people to them. And that includes our free HR fact sheets. But as I put in the chat, you will receive a copy of our fact sheet on board level sort of dispute resolution after today's session. And then if you are at the moment, or you find yourself in the future looking at a dispute or a conflict amongst your board members, or as we've said, between board members and another member of your workforce, you can use your NCVO membership to access a free hour of our time, of our consultancy, to speak to us in confidence with a qualified mediator. So you can come straight to us via the contact details on our website, the links on this slide, and just follow the free 1 hour option. Normally we can arrange that within 1 to 2 days, maximum of you contacting us, and that will be a sort of a safe space for you to explain the situation to the mediator and to just discuss those range of options that are open to you. And we can use the conflict escalator to assess where you are, and base our discussions around that. We won't use that time to sell our services to you. Obviously, if you'd like to have a conversation with us about that, that's fine, but we would do that outside of the 1 hour free. That's provided through our social impact and completely without any sort of obligation on yourselves. So yeah, so we do offer a range of mediation services, and we can discuss those with you, including a sort of entry-level mediation package, which will usually be what you need for a sort of a dispute involving just 2 individuals. But we also offer more bespoke mediation services where we would agree a process with you and quote based on the time we expect it to take. Facilitated conversations will usually only take a smaller number of hours, and as you'd expect, complex mediations involving groups or more than 2 parties, or where the dispute has kind of become very entrenched, can take longer to prepare for. But you can contact us and have a free discussion with no obligations, and then obviously we'd be more than happy to talk to you about our services as well. And just on the next slide, if you don't mind just clicking through, please, Sally, you'll just see the links there just in terms of our free resources that you can access, and also guidance in terms of just signposting you of how to report a serious incident should you need to the Charity Commission as well. So thank you. I'll hand back to yourself, Josie.
Great, thanks. And just before we go, just our final few seconds together, a snack poll is basically going to appear on your screen. And basically, we would just love to hear your initial thoughts on how you found today's webinar. So yeah, if you have time, please do complete that. And also, once the webinar closes, there will also be a short feedback survey which will appear on your browser, where you can give feedback on what was most helpful, what you'd like more information on, and most importantly, where we could make any improvements. So without further ado, I hope the session has been useful, and you've got a list of things you want to do and the conversations you need to have. A huge thanks to our speakers for guiding us through the last hour and for answering your questions. And thank you to all of you for joining. I really do hope it's been useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Many thanks.